Good evening, friends. The book I want to discuss now is by Primo Levi, Survival in Auschwitz, The Nazi Assault on Humanity, also published as If This Is a Man. This is a paperback edition published by Collier Books. The price here is mentioned, 95 cents, just a small footnote. That was a long time ago, 60 years ago. And in fact, just 15 years after the end of the war. Now, before I move to Primo Levi's own reflections on his time in Auschwitz, it is necessary to say something about what the word Auschwitz evokes. There's a very famous aphorism by Adorno in his book Minima Moralia, Reflections on a Damaged Life, where he said famously, "There can be no poetry after Auschwitz." Auschwitz is, as all of you recognize, the name of the most notorious of the extermination camps set up by the Nazis. Now, I also want to add a little footnote before I get back to Auschwitz about extermination camps, because we often hear the phrase, in fact, the phrase we hear much more frequently is concentration camps, and not all concentration camps were extermination camps. Almost all the camps were labor camps, so Auschwitz was both a labor camp and an extermination camp, but not all concentration camps were, in fact, extermination camps. And there is a common view that there were perhaps 10 or 15 of these camps, but the Nazis, in fact, actually had several hundred camps. Auschwitz is the most notorious of these camps. And the book I'm going to discuss today is the first of 4 books that I'm going to talk about in relationship to Auschwitz. Because Auschwitz is also really the code word for man's inhumanity to man, and here I use, pardon the expression, man in the wider sense of the term to embrace humankind, because there were, of course, women who were killed in these camps too. But Auschwitz is the most notorious expression of man's inhumanity to man and of orchestrated killing on a colossal scale, an absolutely colossal scale. So Auschwitz, in fact, is not only Auschwitz, it stands in for all the extermination camps. And I think it is safe to say that the literature on Auschwitz is richer than it is on any of the other camps that were put up by the Nazis. Now, Primo Levi was a chemist, and this book is a Jewish chemist, and this book is a book that is a first-hand account of his time at this lager. Lager is the word for camp. He uses it frequently, and so do many other writers. He describes in the beginning, in just a page or two, the circumstances under which he landed up at Auschwitz. And in fact, he landed up at Auschwitz relatively late. The system of concentration camps, of course, goes back to the 1930s. The first of the camps that was set up by the Nazis was set up at Dachau, which is in the vicinity of Munich. And what is not commonly realized is that Dachau was not set up for Jews at all. It was in fact actually set up for political prisoners, which included Jews, but it wasn't set up explicitly for Jews. And similarly, we have to understand that Auschwitz was set up as part of what, although I'm being just a tad bit anachronistic, because when I speak of the final solution, when I say that it was set up to implement the final solution, well, this idea of the final solution was not technically arrived at the point at which Auschwitz was, in fact, inaugurated as a camp. But then, in fact, the final solution was thought of shortly after Auschwitz came into existence, and Auschwitz became, we could say, the major camp in the Nazi scheme that is known as a final solution. That is, a final solution entailed the extermination of Jews throughout the world. But Auschwitz was not a camp that was exclusively for Jews. This is something that is going to be better understood when I actually talk about the second of the 4 books, and that is a book by Otto Friedrich called The Kingdom of Auschwitz. But let me go back now to Survival in Auschwitz, this book by Primo Levi, which I think is perhaps the most famous of all the memoirs or autobiographies and first-hand accounts that we have of Auschwitz. He was transported from Fossili to Auschwitz on 21st February 1944. Primo Levi was captured by the fascist militia on 13 December 1943. He was 24 years old at that time. And so shortly after he was captured by the fascist militia, he is going to be transported to Auschwitz. And of course, as is the case with most accounts of Auschwitz, not all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly most of them, and I've seen at least, I would say, 15 to 20 of them, and there are hundreds really, most of these accounts begin with the train journey. And that is certainly the case with this book, Survival in Auschwitz. Right? So the first of some 15 chapters is called The Journey. And it is a terrifying account. The book is a chilling narrative of life in Auschwitz. It is a story about barbarism. It is a story about cruelty. It's a story about disease, diarrhea, dysentery, feces, hunger, malnutrition, forced labor, slavery, exploitation. But it is also a story about the will to live. And somehow I'm reminded of this extraordinary passage in the Mahabharata, in a portion of the Mahabharata known as Yaksha Prashna. These are the 100 questions that the Yaksha, the spirit of the lake, if I may put it this way, puts to Yudhishthir. For those of you who are not familiar with the story of the Mahabharata, it is unnecessary for me to go into the whole story, but the Yaksha Prashna story, very briefly, is that when the 5 Pandava brothers are in exile, there's a point at where they're very thirsty. And they spot a body of water. And so first the twins go there, and then they're about to drink water and from the lake, and just as they're about to do so, a voice cries out to them, "Halt," and answer these questions. Well, they go on drinking the water and they fall dead. And that happens to Bhim, and then it happens to Arjun, and then Yudhishthir, the eldest. And Yudhishthir is Dharma himself. Right? He is the very epitome of law, morality, conduct. So when Yudhishthir goes to the lake and is about to drink the water, once again he's told halt, and he does. And then 100 questions are put to him. And he answers each of them in a short phrase, sometimes in a word. And why does all of this come to mind when I read this book? Because one of the questions that comes to mind is the question, what is the greatest wonder in the world? And the greatest wonder in the world, the Mahabharata tells us, is that all around you, a person, all around you, you see people dying, people diseased. The wages of sin, you see the world being engulfed right now in the fires of authoritarianism and the coronavirus pandemic. All around you, you see hell and people dying, and yet you think to yourself, I am immortal. Now there was the will to survive at Auschwitz. The book is very much about that as well, right? But this is a book that is also very philosophical, because it's not just an account of, the brutality, the labor, the sheer mindlessness of some of the things that happened. Right? The author is not simply thoughtful, he's profoundly philosophical. And he begins, once he has described the basics of this journey, people, because the train journey could be several days. And there is yet another book which I hope to take up at a later time, which is a book really on the German use of their national railroads to transport people, among other places, to Auschwitz, and the horrifics of this train journey, because these were like literally cattle wagons, as it were, and they would be bolted from the outside, and people would be crammed into these, largely Jews, crammed into these for days. And there was, of course, no toilets. So where did people urinate? What happened to their excreta? Right? Who has thought about these things? Well, some of the people have written about it. And of course, very little food, if any. And when the doors opened, when the train arrived at Auschwitz and the doors were opened, sometimes there were dead bodies. Sometimes these dead bodies were thrown out of the trains en route. But, as the author says, when he was in captivity and was then given to understand that he would be transported to a place, to a camp, He didn't know. And all the others around him didn't know where they were going to be transported. And they kept on wondering and wondering. And then finally, when they were given the name of a destination, they were told Auschwitz. They almost felt relieved because they were saved from this extraordinary anxiety and uneasiness about not knowing what was going to happen. Now at least they've been told, well, this is where you're going. Right? I mean, these are the kinds of paradoxes, ironies that this book revels in. Right? But the book begins with a reflection about what he calls the ancient grief of the people that has no land, the grief without hope of the exodus, which is renewed every century. Right? And he's, of course, adverting to the long history of anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe. Most of all in Europe. Right? Now, once he's described the journey, he comes quickly to a description of arrival at the camp. And in the other book, in the Otto Friedrich book on the Kingdom of Auschwitz, there's a description of that as well. But that is, of course, more of a scholarly book, a short scholarly book, a very dense book, and how people were separated right at the beginning. You know, if you were sent to the right, it meant one thing. If you were sent to the left, it meant another thing. And Levi has a long description of these kinds of things, that when some people were immediately targeted for the gas chambers, right? And then others were targeted for labor. And this is where Auschwitz has a labor camp, that this history is not properly appreciated by everyone, and he talks about this at considerable length. But it is very important to understand that this book is not intended to offer a comprehensive sociological account, for example, of the political economy of labor. This is really an account of everyday relations. You know, why people were pushed into to doing a certain kind of labor, and how some tried to get out of it, what were the strategies of survival in the camp. Right? And it's these little details, some of which I will share with you, which really make this account extremely riveting. So, for example, when people were lined up to get their daily ration of food, and what was really the daily ration of food? It was a crumb of dry bread and a bowl of soup. And one of the things that the author tells us, and this is on page 28, and we have learnt other things more or less quickly according to our intelligence. Never to ask questions, always to pretend to understand. We have learnt the value of food. Now we also diligently scrape the bottom of the bowl after the ration, and we hold it under our chins when we eat bread so as not to lose the crumbs. We too know that it is not the same thing to be given a ladleful of soup from the top or from the bottom of the vat. And we are already able to judge according to the capacity of the various vats, these large vessels, right, bowls. What is the most suitable place to try and reach in the queue when we line up? See, what he's saying, of course, is that when you lined up in the queue to get the bowl, to get the soup, people strove to be at the back of the queue, not the front of the queue. Everyone was really hungry. And yet, people wanted to be in the back. Why? Because the people in the front would get the soup, which would be the thinnest portion of it, because much of it would settle down. So the further down you go, the thicker the soup, the greater the nourishment you get, the greater the calories you get. And this is something that he mentions once again on page 62. Now, he also reflects on such things as the rules of the camp. Why did they have all of these extraordinary rules? That you had to make up your bed, you had to do things very meticulously. Was it simply because the camp was run by the Germans and the Germans are very meticulous? And sometimes he almost tends to move in that direction, which is a kind of essentialism. But at other times he understands that's the logic of the camp. So let us consider what he says on page 29. We already know in good part the rules of the camp, which are incredibly complicated. The prohibitions are innumerable. To approach nearer to the barbed wire than 2 yards, to sleep with one's jacket or without one's pants or with one's cap on one's head, to use certain washrooms or latrines which are nur für Kapos, that is, these are for the Kapos. The Kapos was, of course, the infamous, the feared, the notorious middlemen, if we may call them that. These were other Jews who were placed in the position of being commanders within the camp at an intermediate level, the people who would compel other Jews to work. Right? And he's describing here all these prohibitions. Not to go for the shower on the prescribed day or to go there on a day not prescribed. The rules and the prohibitions. To leave the hut with one's jacket unbuttoned or with the collar raised. There were rules about all of this, whether you could do that or not. To carry paper or straw under one's clothes against the cold. To wash except stripped to the waist. The rites to be carried out were infinite and senseless. Every morning one had to make the bed. He puts that in quotation mark, rightfully so, because what was the bed? It was really a plank of wood. Perfectly flat and smooth. Smear one's muddy and repellent wooden shoes with the appropriate machine grease. Scrape the mud stains off one's clothes. Paint, grease, and rust stains were, however, permitted. In the evening, one had to undergo the control for lice and the control of washing one's feet. And of course, we can understand that he's saying this is all senseless because the same people who are being asked to wash one's feet, take the lice out of their hair, the next day, some of them were sent to the gas chambers. Right? I mean, what's the point of grooming yourself, so to speak, so carefully and so meticulously if your destiny is to exit, as the Nazis said to all the inmates when they came to the camp, there is no exit from this camp except through the chimney. So if this is what your destiny is, why are you being asked to go through all of these senseless rules as he explains? Right? Now, I think that what he describes here is what in a phrase he calls the demolition of a man. How the human being was reduced to being something other than human, subhuman. And of course, one aspect of it was that every prisoner was given a number. And the number that was tattooed on the arm of Primo Levi was 174517. He also now describes the layout of the camp. He describes the different blocks. And one of the things that's not commonly realized, although he doesn't really have much of a description of this, but this is mentioned in some of the other books that I will take up, that Auschwitz even had a symphony orchestra. It had a stadium. It had a boxing rink. It had a brothel. Right? So Auschwitz was really a mini city. And at one point, however difficult it may be to fathom this, there were as many as 150,000 people there at a single point in time. 150,000 people. Of course, the odds of survival were extraordinary. And indeed, Levi himself was one of the 20 out of the 650 Italian Jews who were in the camp at the time that he was there who actually survived. Life expectancy in the camp, once you got to the camp, the life expectancy on the average was about 3 to 3.5 months. Right? So it is in this vein that Levi writes this account of the time that he spent in the camp. Recall that he arrived there in February 1944, and it is on January 10th, 1945, that the Nazis are going to take a large number of people out of the camp on what is known as the death marches, right? Levi was not on that death march, and one of the reasons he wasn't taken is because he was one of the people who was selected to work because of his special skills to work in a laboratory. He was a chemist, right? So he has an entire discussion of the circumstances under which some people were exempted from work or were placed into different kind of work, and all the kinds of negotiations that took place in this world of work at Auschwitz. So many people, of course, know that in fact, if there is one singular fact that is often mentioned about Auschwitz to sort of suggest the evil of the place, other than the gas chambers and the colossal number of people who were killed, is that when you entered Auschwitz, there was a sign on the gate, "Work shall make you free." Right? So a substantial portion of this book, we can say, is actually also dedicated to describing the culture of work. And this also meant that what Levi describes is the different kinds of communities that developed within Auschwitz, the difference between the Italians, the Poles, and those who came towards the end, that is the Hungarians, and Hungarian was the second most frequently encountered language in the camp after Yiddish. So he describes all of that, and it gives us a sense of everyday life in this mini city. There are also particular characters he describes. He describes a man called Lorenzo. This is on page 109, an Italian who befriended him. And he says very candidly that it was because of Lorenzo that he survived. I quote, "I believe that it was really due to Lorenzo that I'm alive today, and not so much for his material aid." When he says material aid, what he means is that Lorenzo was a kind of man who, from the measly rations that he and everyone else got, he took a portion of that measly ration, a small crumb of bread, for example, and would give it to Primo Levi. Right? And not so much for his material aid, As for his having constantly reminded me by his presence, by his natural and plain manner of being good, that there still existed a just world outside our own. Something and someone still pure and whole, not corrupt, not savage, extraneous to hatred and terror. Something difficult to define, a remote possibility of good, but for which it was worth surviving. The personages in these pages are not men. Their humanity is buried, or they themselves have buried it under an offense received or inflicted on someone else. But Lorenzo was a man. I think that this book, as I mentioned, was originally published as If This Is a Man. And I think that this is partially an allusion to Lorenzo. But Lorenzo was a man. His humanity was pure and uncontaminated. He was outside this world of negation. Thanks to Lorenzo, I managed not to forget that I myself was a man. One of the more interesting parts of the book is also a description that he offers of the survival strategies of some of the people. He gives a few concrete stories. On pages 87 to 88, he offers a story of a person called Elias Lindzen, number 141565. He was a dwarf, not more than 5 feet high, but I have never seen muscles like his, says Levi. And he says that to see Elias work was disconcerting spectacle, right? Because he worked like a maniac. It was almost impossible to stop him. He could lift enormous loads, right? And yet, this being Auschwitz, there had to be a paradox. And here is the passage, page 88. His fame as an exceptional worker spread quite soon, and by the absurd law of the lager, from then on he practically ceased to work. His help was requested directly by the Meister only for such work as required skill and special vigor. Apart from these services, he insolently and violently supervised a daily flat exhaustion, frequently disappearing on mysterious visits and adventures in who knows what recesses of the yard, from which he returned with large bulges in his pockets and often with his stomach visibly full. Right? I think that there's also the supposition that because he was a dwarf, that some of the Nazi officials perhaps had fun with him. Perhaps they took sexual advantage of him, right? And kept him alive for that purpose. And once they had satiated their own sexual desires, then they would reward him, right? Because if he disappeared on these mysterious visits and adventures in who knows what recesses of the yard, from which he returned with large bulges in his pockets and often with his stomach visibly full. That is the implication. But who can blame him? Right? Levi is very clear about that. He's not passing any moral judgment because this is what people had been reduced to. But he's saying in the midst of all of this evil, this muck, some people stood out. The diamond glittered in the midst of all of this. Right? And what he's offering here is also a psychological portrait of just one prisoner. There are a number of other prisoners, inmates, whose psychological portrait he offers, and he says that he doesn't know the outcome of most of them. Right? I mean, most of them died, almost certainly. But some survived. And on pages 90 to 91, he has a description of a man called Henry. He says he found 3 ways to escape extermination. organization, pity, and theft. Page 91. There is no heart so hardened that Henry cannot breach it if he sets himself to it seriously. Right? That Henry was the kind of person who was skilled at theft, could organize some of the other prisoners around him to his own advantage, but could also evoke pity in others. And he concludes his discussion of Henry by saying, I know that Henry is living today. So he did survive. I would give much to know his life as a free man, but I do not want to see him again. Right? Well, in late spring 1944, things began to change a bit. The war was taking a turn for the worse for the Nazis. And one of the things that Primo Levi points out is that as it became clear to the Germans that they were going to lose, they became more vindictive. The rage increased. They became more cruel. Right? They could see what they thought was the look of victory on the faces of the Jews, the people that they had tormented. And this was intolerable to the Nazis. The mockery of revenge as they saw it, right? Their fury grew. So he describes a little bit the outcome of all of this. And it is an interesting account of not only the camp, but the fact that in circumstances of this kind, there was still the possibility of developing certain kinds of human relationships. Right? Now, I have left out from this some of the very gory details. I've indicated some of them, but he says, for example, that in January of 1945, so when the substantial number of the inmates, the prisoners who were still in the camp, when a substantial number of them were taken out on the death marches, very few survived those, right? But some were left behind, though some who were viewed as infirm. And of course, you have to ask yourself, why was there an infirmary? And this is one of the paradoxes that he talks about at considerable length, that there was an infirmary. Right? So that, if you had diarrhea or you had dysentery or you had some other disease, you were taken there. Now, if the whole idea of the camp is that it's an extermination camp, and so someone is diseased or someone has got severe dysentery and you don't treat it, well, over a course of time, they're likely to die. So why not let them die? But no, indeed. They had to be taken to an infirmary. And an effort was made to get them better. And then they were put back to labor. But of course, it's not as though the supply of labor was really finite. For a substantial period of time, this supply of labor was literally infinite for a period of time. So this is one of the things that he's really trying to understand. Is this part of the German mentality? Is this a kind of a thoroughness on their part, or is it the fact that we betray ourselves in various ways, that we might display our worst tendencies and then something within us pulls back and says that, well, there is still a proper way to do things, that if someone is ill, he should be treated. And one of the things he points out is that if a person claimed to have dysentery, because if they had dysentery, then they were exempt from going and doing hard labor. He points out that you had to demonstrate that you had dysentery. So you basically were given 1 minute to produce the kind of bowel movement that would show that you had dysentery. And when I speak of the gory details, I'm speaking about a lot of the details which have to do with excreta. That in January 1945, when the camp was being emptied out, there was almost a kind of layer, not of ice, but of excreta all over the camp, just frozen into place, because this was the coldest month of the year at that point. Right? And the same bowls from which these prisoners, which is the word that was used for them, because of course they hadn't committed any crime whatsoever, except for the crime of simply being a Jew, or being a homosexual, or being a political offender of some kind. Right? And there were ways to distinguish between all of these. This is something I'll speak about when I talk about the next book, Otto Friedrich's The Kingdom of Auschwitz. Right? But he's saying that the same bowls from which these prisoners ate, these bowls were also used for excreta. Right? This is the kind of place that Auschwitz was. Some of the other extraordinary complexities of the culture of Auschwitz, the culture of the Germans, the Nazis, I will seek to talk about when I turn to The Kingdom of Auschwitz by Otto Friedrich in my next talk. But Primo Levi's book, Survival in Auschwitz, is perhaps, I think, the most well-known expression of the culture of this place and the meaning of that word, Auschwitz. Thank you.